speaking of time, many years. That's the nice thing about so much of my work revolving around time, is there's always a connection. Okay. Before I get into the talk, I did want to mention that my father and I also mentioned my book, Time and Despondency, and I last year prepared a Lenten study guide. I printed it off and put it in this plastic case thing, but you can go on the Ancient Faith page for my book, and if you scroll around, this will be a free PDF download, and it splits the book into weekly readings that go through Lent, and there are discussion and reflection, personal reflection questions for each week that are kind of themed with the liturgical themes of Orthodox Lent. So I'm going to pass this around again. It's just a free download on the Ancient Faith page. But if the talk interested you, or the concept of despondency interested you, maybe check that out. And the book group that I mentioned, I host an online book group during Lent that also goes through the book. And it's on Facebook, and it's called the Time and Despondency Official Lenten Reading Group, or something like that. But you can just go there. It's free to join, excuse me. And lots of good discussion in that group. So, redeeming the future. I mentioned that we're kind of going to go through the three parts of time. We covered the present in the first talk. Now we'll talk a bit about the future. The guiding questions for this talk are: how does spiritual sickness affect our view of the future? How is the fear of death at the root of this? And how can we begin to redeem the future with God's help? Redeeming the future, it's an interesting concept because, as I mentioned before, we can't really, we're not in Back to the Future. We're not in a space science fiction film. But in destroying death, I think that Christ kind of, in a way, dismantled some of the boundaries that we think of that surround time. And he helped forge a kind of unity in time. And so even though we can't necessarily go into the future and fix things before they occur in a literal sense, I think in a spiritual sense, we can, with God's help, begin to redeem our relationship with what has not yet happened. So how does our spiritual sickness affect our view of the future? Well, just to review, in despondency, we try to flee from the present moment into our own versions of the past or future. We talked about that in the last talk. And I just want to kind of review some of the typical ways that we can start to escape from the present. In escaping from the present, we start to become entangled in other sins and passions. So just as passions like anger and desire beget the passion of despondency, so too despondency can beget other passions and other spiritual sicknesses in our hearts. So some of these sicknesses are things like worry and anxiety, avarice or greed, financial greed, fear. And I think with regard to the future, we fear a lot of things, but deep down what we fear most of all, and what is often sort of perpetuating the other fears, is the fear of death. Vainglory, which is selfish ambition, and hopelessness. Now what I want to do is just give you some examples. I think both of them, again, are from, one is from, I think these are from Evagrius, both of them. And I'm going to talk about two of these on this list. I'm going to talk about avarice or greed and vainglory or selfish ambition. And just look at how Evagrius describes these passions in his writing, and just pay attention to the ways that these relate to our views of the future. Because this is all of this, past, present, future stuff, this is my interpretation, this is my sort of lens of reading some of Evagrius and other people's ascetical and pastoral theology. And so I kind of want to give you a window into what Evagrius is saying. So here's how one of the comments he makes about selfish ambition. And it's in a section where he's talking about despondency. In fact, I believe this was a quote that you've seen before from the previous presentation. He said, "Despondency drives the monk to desire other sites where he can more easily procure life's necessities, more readily find work, and make a real success of himself." And so in despondency, as the monk starts kind of fleeing from his conditions and trying to imagine what life, a better life for himself, he starts getting into this mentality of places he could go to be, more successful. And I think that we do this a lot as well. We may be stuck in a certain job or circumstance, and we start to imagine, well, if this were different, or if I were in a different place, I'd be successful, I'd be renowned, I'd be maybe given more respect from people in my life. And this starts to get into selfish ambition. Ambition itself is a very future-oriented attitude. It's about achieving something in the future. And I'm not saying that all ambition is wrong. Of course, I went and got my PhD and stuff, and it takes a little bit of grit to do that. And maybe someone call that pride. Certainly we all struggle with pride. But where ambition really where we really start to get into the danger zone is where it becomes sort of selfish, self-focused, where we're willing to put others down in order to make our ambitions come true, or disregard other people and things that need our care and attention in our actual circumstances in favor of sort of our self-fantasy or our self-delusion about this future, super self that we want to become. And I think the really tricky thing is we can start to take on this vainglorious attitude even with regard to quote-unquote good things. So if you think about Lent or fasting, I don't know if you struggle with this, but I do, and I know a fair amount of other people who do, is you start to imagine your super fasting self, the self that prays all the time, the self that not just goes to church all the time, but wants to go to church all the time, and is always kind to one's neighbor, and is always giving, the full amount to the church, and things like that. That's not most of us. Most of us have kind of two selves. We have the self that one day is going to finally figure out the code, and we're going to be the person that everyone looks at who has it all together, even though right now we know that's not really where we're at. And there's kind of a delusion in that, and almost a manipulation of these tools we've been given in the church, these ascetical tools to help us turn towards Christ. And we're somehow turning it into our ego, we're turning it into our pride to get to this place that we think we need to be at. Well, what happens when we get there? What are we going to do? Just pat ourselves on the back? Or feel good about where we've gotten? That's not the goal either. So it's much more, we use the word a lot, authentic, but it's much more authentic and it's much more real to simply be where you're at with your real struggles and take it one day at a time with God's grace. Maybe you never get to the super self. Most of us are never going to get there. But that doesn't matter in a sense, because where we can get to is every day with God's help. So that's selfish ambition. Another interesting passion here is greed, or avarice, to use an older word. And I love this quote from Evagrius about avarice. He says, "Avarice suggests to the mind a lengthy old age, inability to perform manual labor at some future date, famines that are sure to come, sickness that will visit us, the pinch of poverty, the great shame that comes from accepting the necessities of life from others." Elsewhere it says that of an avaricious monk, he says, "Even if death should approach, The monk with many possessions, which is code word for being greedy, cannot take his eye away from material things. So even as, a monk is heading towards death and the future of death is certain, even that cannot wrestle his mind away from the importance of material possessions or wealth. This is a really interesting, just looking back at that first quote, this is a really interesting thing to consider, because I think in our culture, and I'm sure we're not alone historically in this, but we kind of think of it as a merit badge to make it to a certain age. Oh, I'm going to live to be 100. I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to live to be 100. But in living into old age, as I'm sure we know either personally or through caring for others who are elderly, that brings certain worries, because the body starts to break down, or certain things become more difficult. We have sort of Alzheimer's and the loss of memory. And what avarice is, we think of greed as, I just want money. I just want money for money's sake. But how Evagrius sees it is, this greed is actually kind of our insurance policy against the risks that come with old age. So money and financial wealth provide us with a way to numb ourselves from worry, the worry of getting old and all that's associated with it. Because it's out of this fear of, there's going to be a famine, or, I'm going to get arthritis and I'm not going to be able to do things for myself that I was once able to do for myself. Or I'm going to be poor. My retirement money is not going to come. So I need to be saving money now. I need to be getting money now. I need to be getting security now, so that when all those bad things happen, I don't have to depend on anybody, and I can just depend on myself. That is really not the way I think we're used to thinking about greed. And when we think about it that way, I think it's a lot easier to recognize it in ourselves and have sort of some empathy. I want to read the parable of the rich fool that's found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 12, because it kind of gives us a different angle on this passion of greed. So someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to him, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do, for I have no place to store my crops?" Then he said, "I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God." So this statement that this foolish man makes to himself, he says, "Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry." So again, with him, we see this tendency to invest all of this time, energy, and even sort of financial wealth into providing for a future that, first of all, may never come. It didn't come for him. First of all, may never come. But second of all, that future may come. And what are these material goods feel very secure because we can see, taste, and touch them. It doesn't mean that they're going to be any good for us in the future. And in the meantime, what we're doing is we're kind of neglecting the present. We're neglecting the needs of ourselves, of those around us. We're neglecting the call of Christ in the present, so that we can, store up all of our insurance, so that one day maybe we can get to a point where we can relax. But That day never really seems to come, at least not for me, not for a lot of people. And I mean, it's interesting nowadays because, a few decades ago, I think, I don't know about in Canada, but in the States, people would trust a lot in their retirement policies, for example. And now just with where all of the banks are at and the financial situation of the world, like people put a lot less faith in these sort of future-oriented policies. And that can be really anxiety-provoking, but it can also provide us some space to start recognizing, the need to learn to depend on others. Like as the church, we can be a community that provides for one another, even in old age, and allow one another to kind of relax in the present, knowing that people are going to be there to care for us. In Toronto, at our parish, one of the things that we're trying to be really intentional about is we've started a burial society to help people find more affordable costs for burial and traditional burial practices. But along with that, we're trying to start training programs to help people in the church learn how to care for aging family members, aging parishioners who may not have immediate family in their area, right? We have a lot of immigrants who may not have children nearby. And there's this, we're trying to work in this direction where we become a community that has, all different generations, and each generation is providing for other generations in different ways, whether it's caring for them materially or physically, or maybe the older generations also caring for the younger generations emotionally through wisdom and having conversations and things like that. I think that's a really important model to work towards as a church. And like looking out at all of you, I like that there are a lot of different age groups in here. All of this is really, really encouraging. So back to kind of getting into the difficult stuff, which is really the fear of death. I think that as much as we, in our modern, sensible culture, like to pretend otherwise, most of us are really afraid of death. There's a really good quote by Philip Roth, who was a novelist, who said something like, "Inside every sane and reasonable person is another person scared witless about death." And, I think that applies for many of us. I have a quote in my book, and I said that, "For most of my life, I had no word for the strange fusion of sadness, restlessness, and distraction that sprang up whenever the awareness of life's brevity became too overwhelming. The sting of death's reality dulled into mindless avoidance, a way of living that flits from one distraction or aimless worry to the next." So that was my way of recognizing that for myself. The thing that most often prompts me away from the present moment is deep down, subconsciously or pre-consciously or whatever, deep down, the knowledge that I'm going to die is really the thing that I'm always trying to escape from. It may not look like that. It may look like I'm bored. It may look like and even feel like I'm restless or sick of my job or something. But deep down, what that is it's the knowledge that my time isn't going to last forever. And when things don't feel meaningful to me or interesting to me, it's like a huge grief, because you want every moment to count, and you want to have that assurance in each moment that things are going to be okay, and you don't want to have to recognize that this isn't going to last forever, and there's not a lot you can do about it. And we have the hope in the resurrection. But for many of us, there's kind of a disconnect between what we say we believe intellectually, which is the resurrection, and what we actually feel or experience, or the things we actually think about in our daily lives. In the quiet moments, the waking up at 3 a.m., what are you thinking about? Those difficult moments. That's where the disconnect is. So despondency and the fear of death. Despondency is one of many reactions to the fear or reality of death. We hate and become angry at the present because it confronts us with what's outside of our control. And the question is despondency a sin or a sickness, or is it a coping mechanism? And that's something I think a lot about, I think about this for all of the passions, pride, anger, all of these things. We look at them and we can say, that's bad, right? But often what those things are doing, it's not that and they are bad, I don't want to dismiss that, but often what those things are doing is they're allowing us to cope or be sort of a crutch so that we don't have to actually look at the deeper reality. Take pride, for example. If you know somebody who is very evidently prideful or arrogant, let's say, deep down that person is probably very ashamed of themselves. And the pride is simply a cover-up. It's a way of coping with that profound sense of inadequacy that they don't measure up. They're able to project themselves as someone who's prideful and has it all together, when really deep down they feel inadequate and like they're not enough. And I mean, you can look at every passion and just look at it from the backside and realize, as bad as that passion is, it's allowing them to keep functioning as a human being without having to face this deep pain that they're going through. And I think that what despondency is a coping mechanism for as I've been saying, is our fear of death. And if you take the resurrection out of the equation, I actually think despondency is a healthy thing. If you're not someone who believes in the resurrection or has any mechanism for hoping beyond the grave, despondency is the rational response to life as a human being, as a mortal human being. Which means that the resurrection needs to be the center of our lives. The resurrection isn't this abstract thing that we preach and mention on Sundays. It is the be-all, end-all of our faith. St. Paul says that if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. This is in 1 Corinthians 15:14. It's the quote on the right, which is the font is not the right color to be able to see it, unfortunately, in this room. But the point he's making is people doubt, did the resurrection happen? Or was it a real bodily resurrection? Or was it just a spiritual resurrection? Or what was really going on? Well, the fact is, if the resurrection didn't happen, we might as well just stop talking. Because our preaching is empty. Our faith is empty. We don't believe in a historical figure. We don't believe in a good person. We don't believe, well, we do, because Christ was all those things. But the whole reason we keep talking about Christ, the whole reason we keep believing, is because he resurrected. And that's not just a doctrinal point that distinguishes us from the Muslims or something. In rising from the dead, Christ destroyed death. And death is the enemy of the human, this is the enemy of human well-being. So if we have nothing to say about death, if we have no hope to impart in the face of death, this is pointless. That's what Paul is saying. And in the face of despondency, we need to remember that. Redeeming the future. Oh, sorry, one more point to make about this. The tense here is interesting, if Christ is not risen. In the Greek, this is perfect tense, meaning that it conveys a continuous result of a past action, or the action that's being conveyed is ongoing. So if you look in different English translations of this verse, you'll most often find the translation, if Christ has not been risen, or if Christ had not been raised, or something like that, which is not quite what Paul was saying. He was referring to a past action or a past event, but he was also trying to convey that in a way that is still ongoing, where the results of that are still ongoing. And that's why I like the New King James translation of this verse, because it says, if Christ is not risen. Because our faith as Orthodox Christians is lived in the present tense. Christ, we don't say Christ has risen, we say Christ is risen. You know? And we proclaim that today is the day of salvation. It doesn't really matter what the calendar date says, you know, what the date on the calendar is, because the fact is, Christ was risen, he is risen, and he is being raised. This is all, you know, past, present, and future. That is the past, present, and future of our faith. So redeeming the future. And here I have the icon of the resurrection. You know, what better icon do we have that sort of summarizes and epitomizes the Christian faith other than this one? And what I love about this icon, just in the context of today's discussion, is what is Christ doing? He's pulling Adam and Eve up from death. He's pulling our past as humanity into the present moment of the resurrection. And that is really, he didn't just do that, you know, once and for all. That this is like the continuous movement of our faith, allowing our sinful and broken past to be pulled up into the sort of continuous, eternal, ongoing present of the resurrection, you know, for now and ever and into the ages of ages. This will continue to be our present moment in Christ, whatever may come in the future. So just as I mentioned some sort of practical suggestions about countering despondency in our lives, I wanted to point out some antidotes that typically come up with some of the passions that affect our view of the future. And so these are 3 virtues that lead us back to the present when we're preoccupied with the future. The first, of course, is patience. Patience. When we think about the future, whether we're anxious or whether we kind of have a positive, you know, I want to really make something of the future, I want to make something of myself in the future, we start to wish it will come faster. I wish tomorrow would get here. And having patience is something that can guard against that attitude. Another thing that Evagrius really talks about is freedom from possessions. And this was, again, he's talking to monastics. So in his day, you know, a monk would leave his home and his family behind, and he would kind of venture out into the desert. Now we think of that as automatic poverty. If he's living in the desert, you know, how could he procure possessions? But that wasn't exactly the case, and there were some centers of monasticism that we'll say were a bit less monastic than other centers of monasticism. And this is one reason why Evagrius sort of started in one area of the Nitrian desert, and then he eventually went deeper into the desert, was because that area was like already so populated by other monks and people visiting monks that it started to become a kind of metropole in and of itself, like a monastic center. And people would come and visit desert monks, and they would bring them things. Or the monks would have to leave the desert and go back to the city for temporary periods of time to not conduct business, but maybe, I don't know, to sell things, to sell things to gain money in order to give to the poor or what have you. And Evagrius spent a lot of time like practically teaching monks, well, when you do that, don't procure certain possessions. Like, make it a habit to get rid of whatever you happen to procure during your time in the city, or whatever gifts people happen to give you. He told them also, don't take a servant. Some monks had servants to sort of help with some of the daily necessities, And he said, like, this is really bad for a lot of reasons. One of them is that it gets you into this greed mentality of needing more. But at the heart of this advice was the fact that the more you have materially, the more stress and antagonism this causes with regard to the future. My husband and I was telling Lorna, we bought a new car this fall. It's our first new car. Anyone who, maybe Father Andrew remembers the car that my husband used to drive, which was a death trap. It was like a, I don't know, 92 Tercel or something like that, but it was like rusted and like sometimes wouldn't run. So we had gotten rid of that 3 years ago or so, and we were just doing public transportation for a long time, just to see if we could do that. And then eventually we kind of came to the conclusion that public transportation is great, but we do need a car for some things. And so we debated for a while, and we were going to get a used car, but then it ended up actually being more affordable to get a new car. Long story. But, I told my husband, because I had bought in my earlier life, my former life in the States, I had bought a nice Toyota in graduate school, but I wasn't allowed to bring it to Canada because somebody's country has certain customs rules that precludes transferring possessions across borders and things like that. Anyway, I told him, what's going to happen as soon as we drive off this lot, you hear like the value diminishes. Okay, we knew that was going to happen, but I'm like, another thing that's going to happen is as soon as we drive off this lot, you're going to start worrying about the first scratch or the first dent or the first, rainstorm that is going to start that very gradual years-long process of rust starting or, the paint job getting dulled. And it's true. It's when you have a certain possession, you then start worrying. You form a relationship with that thing, and you start worrying about it. And if you're not careful, that can become like a real part of your thought process, And now we live in this age with Marie Kondo and this whole ethos of like, if it doesn't spark joy, then get rid of it. Well, that's great. That, on the one hand, that seems to line up with this freedom from possessions, right? But on the other hand, that can just become this whole other mind game of, well, does this spark joy? Does it not? If it doesn't, is something wrong with me? Should I get rid of it? Should I throw it away? Should I give it to the thrift store? And I think that, we need to be thinking about all of these questions before we actually get the possessions in the first place. Should we have, how can we find ways to just simply not accumulate or find a way of being in the world that isn't somehow dependent on the things we have? I'm not saying be homeless or something. I'm just saying there's somehow a space for moderation that I think many of us have to work hard to stay in that place of moderation, especially if we're, living in the world and in the 21st century where possessions are just very easy to accumulate. And what that does is it starts to free us from our worries of the future. We no longer have to worry, is our car going to be around in 5 years? And if it's not, how are we going to afford a new one? We don't have to have all of those questions. A third sort of virtue is the remembrance of death. Remembrance of death. And we kind of had that quote at the end of the last talk, where the sort of first step is to situate yourself in your cell and actually look at your body. Actually look at the way your body has changed, and the wrinkles that are there that didn't used to be there. We can look at those in kind of despair, or we can look at those and say, oh, that's a reminder that I'm not going to be here forever. And how can that shift the way that I act? When we have these in our head, we love our neighbors, right? But then when we're going about our real life and someone cuts us off, or we have to wait for 3 people at the grocery store, and one of them has to pay with exact change, et cetera, et cetera. And in our minds, it's easy to jump to this place where I'm going to be nasty. I'm going to give him a look because I'll have another opportunity later for some other person to show love to that person. I don't need to show love now. But when we look at the wrinkles on our body, when we look at the time, that has changed for us physically, we remember, I may not get another opportunity. This is the opportunity that I'm given. So act accordingly. Think accordingly. It can really be a helpful reminder. And finally, again, Thanksgiving. As I mentioned before, Thanksgiving is like the antidote to anything. If you want to know how to counter any spiritual sickness, Thanksgiving will probably help you in some way, shape, or form. But how can we give thanks in a way that shifts our anxieties about the future? I don't know when I'm going to die. I could die tomorrow. My plane could crash tomorrow. Apparently the Boeing engines had this software glitch. They were telling me all about it last night at dinner, right after I had flown in.
But it wasn't one of those planes.
Well, here's the thing. My first flight yesterday was canceled for a mysterious reason, but it was probably because of this software glitch. And then they put us on a new plane. So I'm going to be checking the model of my plane home. But the point is, I could die tomorrow. My plane could crash. I don't know. But I can't change that. And I can't change the not knowing. Like, I can have it in my mind that maybe I'm going to die tomorrow. But maybe I'm not. And I don't know. And I can't know. God knows. I don't know. And I don't need to know. But what I do know is that I'm here right now with all of you. And we get to read Evagrius. And we get to think about why all of this is important. And we get to remember Christ. Like, what greater thing do I have to give thanks than the ability right now to remember Christ? And we can always find that kind of space in our present moment to give thanks, whatever we're going through. Last Lent, my father-in-law was dying, my husband's father, and I forget what the date of Pascha last year was.
8th of April, if I remember correctly.
Okay, so my father-in-law died on May 16th, and that was like the last day that you could say Christ is risen. So it was on the, right as things were shifting. And so I remember during Holy Week, we could barely go to any of the services. He was in the hospital, he had metastasized cancer. And I remember thinking, at the time we weren't sure, we sort of had some hope that he was going to eventually pull through. So things were bad, but we had this little bit of hope, but things were still bad. And I remember at one point thinking, oh, it's too bad we can't go to the services this year because, we're missing something really important. No, wrong. What was important is that we were able to be with him in that moment. And as bad as things were, like, we had this time that we could spend with him. And that's what all this is about. Like, fasting is great. Prayer is great. And the services are wonderful. But all of those, in a sense, maybe not the prayer part, but certainly the fasting and the almsgiving and the services, they're all kind of training wheels to get us to a point where we can actually enter our actual lived experiences in the here and now, the difficult experiences, and be Christ and see Christ in one another. Like, that's what this is all about. It's not getting through the real experiences so that we can make it to church. Church is important, but it's training us towards something deeper in our real lives. And I have to remember that and learn to be in these moments and give thanks for them, regardless of what I think I'm missing or going to miss in the future. So I want to end this talk also with a thought exercise, a meditation, if you will. And I just wrote about this the other day on my blog, so if you're getting this a second time around, I'm sorry, but I'm not sorry, because this is a really profound thought. So Evagrius writes, our holy and most ascetic master, who is probably Macarius of Egypt, his teacher, stated that the monk should always live as if he were to die on the morrow, but at the same time that he should treat his body as if he were to live on with it for many years to come. I like this quotation because it kind of helps us strike a balance between this sense of urgency that I think is really needed in the faith, that I could die tomorrow. I may not get another chance to love my father-in-law. I may not get a chance to love the neighbor who's insisting on paying with exact change in the grocery store line. So we have to live as if every moment were our last, or every day were our last. But if we go too far into that, we start to maybe become hyper-vigilant or hyper-anxious. Oh, every moment could be the last. Every moment could be the last. And that in and of itself can be like too much of a good thing. So on the flip side, we need to kind of balance that idea by treating our bodies, and I would say the bodies of others, if we're caring for people, treating the body as if it will be around for a long time. And that helps us really moderate these things. Well, I may die tomorrow, and I'm going to pray, and I'm going to act towards others as if I'm going to die tomorrow. But I'm going to sort of behave in the world as though there may be a future. I'm going to treat my body as though there may be a future. Martin Luther had a quote, "Even if I knew the world were to end tomorrow, I would still plant my little apple tree today," which I think he was pulling from the Talmud. But anyway, the point is, even if you feel that life is really short and that you are going to die tomorrow, which is sort of a good attitude to have, you still have to go about in the world and do the things that need doing, because you can't get into, like, the thought that your life may end tomorrow is supposed to bring joy and energy rather than despair. And I think that these two things can sort of help balance one another out as we sort of try to envision our participation in the future. So I'll end, I think, with that for this talk, and I think we have a coffee break.
Okay.